So we've looked at the overview of the economic situation and the goals, and now let's look at some of the economic policies. I'm not going to go into these in huge amount of depth, just giving an overview of the different things that he did. What I would recommend that you do is to pick a couple of them and maybe study them a little bit more in depth so that you have specific knowledge to use. You've seen these learning outcomes, understand the goals, analyze the causes of success, and understand the relationship between the system and the failure of the economic reform. As part of his desire to improve the economic productivity of the Soviet Union, Gorbachev implemented a campaign against alcoholism in 1985. And if you remember, this is essentially a continuation of what Andropov wanted to do. It was a recognition that the alcohol consumption was having a really negative impact on the growth and efficiency of the country. So the campaign against alcoholism is part of the greater drive for honesty, openness, and discipline. Honesty in terms of limiting corruption, reducing corruption, discipline in terms of people getting into work on time, working their full shift and doing what they're supposed to do, and openness, part of this increasing transparency within the government and within the larger society. And this is all part of the Glasnost and Perestroika policies of Gorbachev. And this is all, again, part of helping the society function in a more efficient manner. And that will then, therefore, contribute to the development of the economy and the improvement in the material lives of people. And what the government is going to do is the government reduces the amount produced and sold. And so there is less alcohol available, that it has therefore increased the price of alcohol and thereby reducing consumption. And some aspects of this was a success. There was a reduced number of deaths and increased life expectancy. There was a reduction in crime. There were huge numbers of accidents as people were being drunk and so on and so forth. There was a lot of support from, Gorbachev says, there was a lot of support from the women, because this then had a positive impact on the family life. However, there were some aspects of it that were hugely fail-tastic. There was a huge amount of resistance to the reduction in alcohol. It's one of those things, as I've said previously, in societies in which people feel marginalized, one of the things that they often do is revert to use drugs extensively in order to help them deal with their situation. And people loved, apparently, their alcohol. So one of the things was that there was a huge rise in the black market. If the government was not allowing alcohol to be sold in the shops, then of course there will be people at home who are going to be producing their own alcohol. And the negative consequence of that is there is no regulation no regulation on the amount of alcohol and the processes, so a number of people were poisoned and died. There were huge lines in order to be able to get it, so this was not very successful in that sense. As Gorbachev said, the women supported it, the men were incredibly unhappy. There was a loss of government revenue. It was really weird, but the government produced a huge amount of the alcohol, and the sale of it accounted for something like 25%. Can you imagine? 25% of government revenue. That is more than the selling of oil and gas. And so this meant that as people shifted toward the black market, this means that the government is not making the income that they need in order to run the programs. Therefore, because of the social opposition and the financial cost to the government, this was abandoned in 1988. And in 2005, in an interview, Gorbachev said that this anti-alcoholism campaign was too hasty. He also said that it wasn't supposed to be quite as intense or extensive as it wound up being because the lower level party officials were a little overzealous. And basically what Gorbachev says is that in order for something like this to be successful, it has to be long-term, and it has to be slow, and it has to be continual, steady. And basically, alcoholism was a huge problem that this program didn't really solve. It just drove it underground. So here we have a handy-dandy graph showing the death rate per 1,000 of the population in relation to the anti-alcohol campaign. And so the solid line that wavers shows the adjusted death rate, and the dotted line shows the actual pre-campaign prediction of the death rate. And as you can see, during the years that this campaign was implemented, there was a really big drop in the death rate. Essentially, in order to deal with some of the changes that had been taking place politically, Gorbachev is going to create a new bureaucracy to handle the economic situation. Remember, part of the political change was to increase distance between the Communist Party and the apparatus of the state. All right, so essentially he creates this new bureaucracy that now you have evaluators and controllers within the factories trying to make sure that they're efficient and people are on time, and they're actually going to try to work at profit. Essentially, though, it is a simplistic way of dealing with an incredibly complex problem. One of the things that we stated previously is that as the system has gotten more complex, more technology, as the economy has grown, there is increasing difficulty with trying to have people plan it instead of letting the invisible hand or the market or supply and demand direct it. And so essentially it's just an extra layer of something that the efficiency of the factories at that level isn't the problem. The real problem is that the entire system isn't really working together in a rational way. And of course, this alienates the working class because people who were used to going to work, hungover, relaxing as they would, and still receiving their paycheck are now being forced to work in a way that they don't really see the value of. In November 1985, he establishes the State Committee for the Agro-Industrial Complex called GOSAGroprom, who knows. And basically the idea was to invigorate agriculture. One of the things that we have been speaking about is that agriculture generally had the lowest amount of investment, and they were not food self-sufficient. They were constantly having to import from elsewhere, and they were also vulnerable to drought and famine, etc. And so it was supposed to do this by creating more financial stabilization, as well as things like soil conservation, better education and use of industrial product. And so the idea is to kind of connect agriculture more closely with industry so that agriculture can improve and the cost, the food and things can improve for people as well. But this added just another level of centralized bureaucracy. So more inefficiencies to the system, decreased rationality, etc. In 1986, he launched the 12th five-year plan, and the idea here was to emphasize investing in machinery. As we know that the industrial sector within the Soviet Union was falling behind that of the West. There had been very limited innovation and development, and machines were old and inefficient. So the idea here was to invest in that machinery by spending that money at the ground level. Then you can have improvements at the other parts of the system. But essentially, there is no real change in the existing system. There was the goal, but nothing happened. And a result is there's increasingly serious balance of trade deficit. So essentially what that means is they are falling further and further behind, and they have to import more and more from the West, from outside of the Soviet Union and outside of Eastern Europe. In 1985, there was 17 billion rubles was spent buying stuff from outside. By the time in 2 years later, just 2 years later, it had almost quadrupled to 64 billion rubles. Now, the money that is spent on buying stuff from the outside is less money that is being spent on developing the country. And a lot of this was spent on importing Western technology. And this was a big goal, but apparently it's expensive. The other thing, as we've spoken about previously, was this drop in alcohol sales from the anti-alcoholism campaign. And this alcohol was a huge amount of government income. Now the government is having to send money outside the country to buy stuff, and they also don't have the income to invest as they planned. Whew. And the hits just keep on coming, because the mid-'80s was a time of incredibly cheap oil. And so one of the big things that they did to make a foreign currency was sell oil and natural gas. So oil prices and gas prices are very low. You combine, and so there's reduced government income. The drop in alcohol sales, again, reduced government income, sending that money abroad to import Western technology. So you have this sort of like perfect storm brewing of the government not being able to meet her obligations. Now, this was a move towards the left. From 87 and 88, you have what is called a regulated market economy. And the idea was to introduce elements of capitalism. So, again, the regulated market economy is an attempt at creating a middle ground between the market and command economy, kind of still keeping communism, but allowing the two systems to kind of run together side by side, thereby having the benefits of both. And so what you have is the law on state enterprise was passed in June 1987. And basically, this was related to Lenin's the new economic program, and similar ideas about what you are supposed to be doing. And basically what it allowed for was for some decentralization of economic planning. So instead of all of the economic planning happening in Moscow, it would be going to people, more of it would be in the hands of people who know the local conditions and who are a little bit better at making some of these micro decisions that go into the macro. This also allowed for greater autonomy for factory managers, again, in terms of setting quotas, in terms of gathering materials, requesting materials, so on and so forth. It also allowed for small-scale private businesses, so that means individuals could set up their own businesses and earn profit. And cooperatives were set up, and people were allowed to trade privately. And state-run businesses could now sell part of whatever they produce on the open market. So before, the government set the price for all of the goods being sold in the country, essentially. And so now the state-owned businesses could sell their stuff and let the price fluctuate on the market. So not just what the government said, and thereby increasing their price. So it came into effect in January 1988, and by May, so 5 short months later, the cooperatives were selling both in the USSR and abroad. And there was this massive increase in independent cooperatives from 14,000 in 1988 to 245,000 in 1991. And so this kind of like fed into a need of people to, one, earn more, and two, kind of direct their labor, right? Which really is what Marx said, right? And so it solves some of the unemployment issues that were happening in the country. And people now have more money in their pockets. But this creates problems because now that these great profits are available, the state officials are taking their cut. And so the state is losing money, the government is losing money because it's not getting all of the money that it should because of corruption. People are lining their own pockets. And of course, we know that the black market had been and has been really strong. A full 25% of the Soviet economy was in the black market. So with the expansion of private industry, the mafia also increases its operations. That's a negative. Some aspects of this regulated market economy did work, but many did not. And all alongside that, you also have massive inflation. And as y'all well know, inflation is bad news. Now, there is a massive inflation because price controls are loosened. Now that the government is no longer setting the prices, they start fluctuating and rising massively. And so the response is to print more money. And I don't know why they always print more money, because you and I both know that printing more money is just the only way to more inflation. And so workers also elected their own managers who increased their wages, basically to try to deal with this. So now they have to pay higher wages as well. And the government has to pay these wages because a lot of these were state-owned enterprises. There is an increase in the shortage of goods because the price is so high, especially on things that have to be imported. There's a rationing of meat and sugar in 1988 as a result of all of this. By 1990, 40% of the hard currency earnings had to be spent on food imports. As a result, there's little left over to purchase Western technology to help fund the economy. It's a bit of a like catch-22, damned if you do, damned if you don't. Right. So here we have a handy-dandy graph, and this is here to illustrate two things. One, that negative balance of trade that was existing. But this one specifically looks at the trade in grain and agricultural products. So in food, just how much of their income is having to be spent on importing food. Now, Gorbachev didn't attempt radical reform until 1990 with something called the 500-day plan. And as well you know, the Soviet Union collapses in 1991. So this is a day late and many dollars short. And this 500-day plan was developed by radical reformers. And the point of this was to shift in 500 days the economy from where it was to a complete market economy. Privatizing stuff, getting the government out of the economy, and letting things go by supply and demand. And there are a bunch of economists involved, a bunch of people who had experience with the West, but the rightists within the government kind of pecked at Gorbachev until essentially they waffled on it and they passed something that was a shadow of this 500-day plan, that didn't have a timetable of when this was supposed to happen, that also didn't have a timetable of how it was supposed to work between Russia and the other Soviet republics. The failure to really pass this 500-day plan as it was meant that the radicals were no longer willing to work with the government. And so this now creates a break, and we'll see this when Yeltsin essentially pushes Gorbachev out of office. But 1990, we saw a further downturn in the economic situation. The GNP, the gross national product, fell by 9%. So the economy is shrinking at a time when these reforms were supposed to be improving and increasing. And so all of this, the failures of the economic situation are going to feed into the last year of the Soviet Union and Gorbachev's rule when the Soviet Union collapses. Now, is it the economy or is it the political situation? I would say it's a bit of both.